What really ended one of the internet's most passionate DIY communities? On June 6, 2005, Steve Jobs stepped onto the WWDC stage and delivered a message that would ripple through both Apple's own ranks and the broader tech world. Apple was leaving behind the PowerPC chips that had powered Macs for over a decade. The future, Jobs declared, would run on Intel processors. He laid out the reasoning in plain terms. PowerPC could not keep up with Intel's performance per watt, and Apple's ambitions for lighter, faster, and more capable machines demanded a new direction. To smooth the transition, Apple introduced the concept of universal binaries, single applications that could run natively on both PowerPC and Intel Macs. This was not just a technical convenience for developers. It was a public commitment that users would not be left behind and that all software would run on the new hardware from day one. Under the hood, Apple had quietly maintained an x86 version of Mac OS X for years, preparing for this very moment. The first Intel-based Macs arrived in January 2006, the iMac and the MacBook Pro. Suddenly, the same x86 architecture that powered nearly every PC was at the heart of every new Mac. Apple's own marketing leaned into the possibilities, highlighting performance, battery life, and even the ability to dual boot Windows via Boot Camp, which arrived a few months later. But this shift did more than just boost Apple's product line. It created a technical overlap between Apple's hardware and the vast world of commodity PCs. For the first time, the barrier between Mac OS X and standard x86 machines started to blur. The code that powered a MacBook Pro could, in theory, run on any Intel-based system if you could find a way past Apple's hardware checks and boot process. Jobs' announcement and the arrival of Intel Macs marked the opening of a door. Behind it, a new kind of tinkerer started to wonder if Apple could make Mac OS X run on a generic Intel chip. Maybe they could too. In the months after Apple's Intel announcement, a handful of determined tinkerers began probing the boundaries of Mac OS X. The first real breakthrough came not from a company, but from scattered posts on forums like OSX86 Project and Insanely Mac. Armed with Retail Tiger and Leopard installed disks, these early hackers set out to answer a simple question. Could you convince Apple's operating system to run on an ordinary PC? The answer arrived in the form of patched installer images, homemade ISOs with the kernel's hardware checks stripped out. Instead of looking for a genuine Apple motherboard or a proprietary system management controller, these modified kernels would accept almost any Intel-based CPU. By late 2005, images labeled Mac OS X 10.4.10 patched Intel.iso began to circulate, each one a ticket into forbidden territory. Behind the scenes, a pseudonymous figure named Netcas became a legend. In January 2006, he published a kernel patch that did two things. It spoofed the CPU ID check, tricking Mac OS X into thinking it was running on approved hardware, and it removed the boot device restriction that normally locked out generic PCS. With Netcas's patch, the installer no longer cared about Apple's custom firmware. Suddenly, the walls were down, but getting to the desktop was not just about bypassing a single check. The system's ACPI tables, those cryptic blueprints that describe every piece of hardware, needed to match what Mac OS X expected. Builders learned to extract and edit DSDT files, swapping out hardware IDS and class codes so that a Gigabyte or Asus board could masquerade as an iMac. These edits, painstakingly documented in forum threads, became a rite of passage for anyone chasing that first successful boot. At this stage, there was no system integrity protection, no mandatory code signing, and few locked doors. The kernel was open to modification, and driver loading was a matter of finding or patching the right text. Each success story fueled more experimentation, and a sense of shared discovery began to spread. What started as isolated hacks quickly became a blueprint, a foundation for the tools and guides that would soon make the Hackintosh dream accessible to thousands. By 2009, the Hackintosh scene had outgrown its patchwork roots. What started as a gauntlet of manual kernel hacks and cryptic ACPI edits was about to get a much-needed dose of simplicity. That year, a new tool called Multibeast arrived on the TonyMax86 forums. Multibeast was a revelation, a friendly graphical app that let builders check boxes for their motherboard, or audio and network chipsets, then installed the right drivers and tweaks all in one shot. Instead of poring over endless forum posts or hand-editing system files, newcomers could get a working macOS desktop in a single afternoon. Multibeast's impact was immediate. Guides and compatibility lists flourished. The infamous buyer's guide threads became a rite of passage, with users chasing the perfect combination of Intel CPUs, Gigabyte or Asus motherboards, and compatible graphics cards. Success stories poured in, photos of home-built towers running Snow Leopard, Geekbench scores, and triumphant screenshots of Final Cut Pro 10 launches. The barrier to entry had dropped so far that even users with no Unix background could join the movement. For many, the thrill was not just technical, it was the sense of beating the system, of getting pro-level performance on a budget. But as hardware advanced, the Hackintosh world needed more than one-click installs. UEFI firmware was now standard on PCs, and Apple's own Macs had switched to it. The community needed a bootloader that could handle this new reality. Enter Clover, first released in 2012, but gaining momentum by 2014. Clover brought a flexible, graphical boot menu and deep UEFI support. For the first time, Hackintosh builds could boot Mac OS with the same seamlessness as a real Mac. Clover introduced config.plist files, structured, editable configurations that let users patch ACPI tables, inject device properties, and manage kexts on the fly. No more black box scripts, builders could now see and tweak every setting. Clover's rise also marked a cultural shift. The days of lone wolf experimentation gave way to collaborative documentation and open source development. GitHub repositories for kexts and bootloader patches became the norm. Figures like Rehabman, known for meticulous kernel and driver work, became household names in the community. His USB and power management patches, shared in sprawling forum threads, saved countless builds from random shutdowns or sleep failures. The ethos was clear: share your knowledge, document your fixes, and help the next builder avoid your headaches. With Multibeast and Clover, the Hackintosh project transformed from a technical curiosity into a global hobby. The tools did not just lower the barrier, they built a bridge, turning a fringe pursuit into something anyone with patience and curiosity could attempt. The result was a vibrant, ever-growing ecosystem where even ambitious newcomers could build a Mac rival from off-the-shelf parts and be welcomed into a community that thrived on shared discovery. A single forum post could launch 1,000 builds. In 2014, a guide appeared on TonyMax86 that spelled out every detail of a Final Cut Pro X machine that cost under $1,000. The parts list read like a greatest hits of Hackintosh hardware: Intel Core i7-4770K, Asus Z97 motherboard, 16 GB of RAM, and a GTX 970 graphics card. The total cost came in at just under $1,000, less than a third of what Apple charged for a comparable iMac or Mac Pro. Benchmarks from that thread showed Final Cut Pro X rendering a 5-minute 1080p timeline in under 2 minutes, matching the performance of Apple's own high-end desktops. The real story wasn't just the hardware, it was the ritual that followed. Every macOS update brought a wave of anxiety. The moment a new version dropped, forums lit up with warnings, "Don't update yet, drivers are broken." Veteran builders and volunteers jumped into action, dissecting the release notes and picking apart kernel changes. Within 72 hours, new patches and updated kexts would appear, posted by names like Rehab Man or Acid Anthera. The community's unwritten rule was clear: no one gets left behind if the right patch is possible. Keeping a Hackintosh alive meant learning the rhythm of release day panic, late night troubleshooting, and small victories. A builder might spend hours tracking down a USB sleep bug or hunting for an audio kext that worked with a specific Realtek chip. Some fixes were shared as step-by-step guides, others as zipped EFI folders with hand-edited config.plist files. The process could be exhausting, but it was also a source of pride. One forum regular put it plainly: "I could buy this machine, run Final Cut, and pocket $2,500 in savings. If it breaks, I replace it. If Apple updates macOS and breaks drivers, I troubleshoot. It was worth it." The camaraderie was real. Build logs became personal diaries, with users documenting every BIOS tweak and patch applied. A successful boot was announced with screenshots, Geekbench scores, and a list of what worked and what didn't. Volunteers responded to cries for help at all hours, sometimes pushing out a patched kext or a new bootloader config within hours of a problem surfacing. The pace was relentless, but so was the sense of accomplishment. Underneath the polish, every Hackintosh was fragile. A single macOS update could break sleep, Wi-Fi, or even the ability to boot. Yet the community kept coming back, driven by the challenge, the savings, and the satisfaction of beating the odds. For a decade, the rhythm held: build, patch, share, repeat. The legend of the $1,000 Final Cut Pro X rig wasn't just about hardware, it was about the people who kept it running, patch after patch, long after Apple had moved on. Hackintosh builders once had room to experiment, but Apple's walls kept rising, one after another. In September 2015, macOS El Capitan introduced System Integrity Protection, known as SIP. It locked down system directories, blocking even root access and unsigned code from touching the core of the operating system. Suddenly, the routine of dropping kexts into system folders was off limits. Community guides scrambled to adapt, adding new steps: boot into recovery, run CSRUtil disable, just to keep patched drivers alive. A forum regular captured the new mood: every update is a new obstacle course. SIP just raised the bar. The following year, macOS Sierra version 10.12 made things even tighter. KEXT signing became mandatory. Now, every kernel extension had to be cryptographically signed by a registered Apple developer. For independent developers, this was not just technical, it was personal. Some worried about exposing their identities or risking Apple's legal attention. A few stepped back. Others found workarounds, sharing guides for self-signing, or distributing pre-built kexts through back channels. The process grew complicated. Disable SIP, sign kexts, patch the bootloader, and hope nothing broke with each update. As one longtime builder put it, "I spend more time reading patch notes than editing video, but I'm not giving up yet." Late 2017, Apple introduced the T2 security chip in the iMac Pro. The T2 was not just another chip, it controlled secure boot, encrypted storage, and Touch ID. On official Macs, T2 enforced a strict boot chain with no unsigned kernels, no tampering, and no way in. Hackintosh rigs did not have T2, but its arrival sent a message. Each new Mac with T2 meant fewer models the community could mimic, and more features locked behind hardware only Apple could provide. Forum posts from 2018 and 2019 carried exhaustion and resignation. Every new Mac is more locked down. How long can we keep patching? By the end of the decade, SIP, KSS signing, and hardware security boxed in the Hackintosh world. Ingenuity kept the dream alive, but the cracks were showing. The question was no longer just if macOS could run on a PC, but for how much longer. Apple's announcement at WWDC 2020 drew a line in the sand. The Mac was leaving x86 behind, not for another vendor, but for Apple's own silicon. The new M1 chip built on ARM architecture was more than just a processor swap. It was a complete reimagining of what a computer could be. The M1 fused CPU, GPU, neural engine, and system memory into a single tightly integrated system on a chip. There were no separate RAM sticks, no slot for a graphics card, no modular parts for tinkerers to swap out. Everything from the memory to the graphics pipeline was soldered and sealed. For Hackintosh builders, the technical foundation they had relied on for 15 years simply vanished. The old playbook, which included patching kernels, injecting texts, and spoofing ACPI tables, depended on the shared DNA between Intel Macs and commodity PCs. Suisa. ARM shattered that. The instruction set was different, the boot process was cryptographically locked, and the memory architecture was deeply intertwined with Apple's custom hardware. Even if you could get macOS to start on a non-Apple ARM board, it would stall at the first hurdle. No compatible drivers, no signed firmware, no access to the unified memory that every part of the operating system expected. Apple's secure boot chain enforced at the hardware level meant there was no EFI partition to tweak, no open core or clover to slip in a patch. The entire system was designed to reject anything not signed by Apple. Rosetta 2, Apple's translation layer, could run x86 apps on Apple Silicon, but it did not touch drivers or low-level code. There was no translation for the kernel, no path for third-party texts. With each new M-series chip, the hardware became more proprietary, the firmware more opaque. By the time the M1 MacBook Air and Mac Mini shipped in November 2020, the reality was clear. The Hackintosh era was over. The community that once thrived on clever workarounds and shared discoveries faced a wall that could not be scaled. Apple Silicon did not just close the door on x86 hacks. It welded it shut, ushering in a future where the only way to run macOS was on Apple's own terms. When x86 Hackintosh faded, the community fractured. Each user weighed priorities. Some chased cost, others clung to familiar tools, and many sought flexibility above all. Linux drew a steady stream with distributions like Pop! OS and Fedora, but Asahi Linux, launched in 2021, stood out. Asahi's promise was a full desktop experience on Apple Silicon Macs, even if it meant leaving behind Final Cut Pro or Logic. Forum posts captured the shift, a video editor swapping Final Cut for DaVinci Resolve on Ubuntu, a developer trading macOS for the open source control of KDE. The freedom to tinker came with sacrifices, but for many it was worth it. Others refused to let go of Intel Macs. Used Mac Minis from 2018 and iMacs from 2019 became prized, running bare metal or through virtualization. Parallels and UTM allowed x86 macOS to limp along inside Apple Silicon, extending old workflows despite slower performance. Cloud services offered another path. Mac Stadium began renting racks of Intel Mac Minis, letting freelancers and studios access remote macOS desktops for a monthly fee. For those who once built Hackintosh render farms, this was a way to keep Xcode or Final Cut alive without new hardware. Yet latency and recurring costs brought their own limits. Some migrated to Windows, especially users of Adobe Creative Cloud or 3D tools. Cheaper hardware and fewer driver issues made the switch easier, even if it meant leaving macOS behind. The old Hackintosh path closed. New routes emerged. Linux, cloud services, Windows, and Intel holdouts, each shaped by necessity and adaptation. Attempts to run macOS on non-Apple ARM hardware have mostly stalled at the proof of concept stage. Projects like QEMU and UTM can technically boot ARM versions of macOS in a virtual machine, but the results are little more than scientific curiosities. Graphics acceleration, sound, and even basic input often fail because Apple's drivers expect hardware features found only on genuine Apple silicon chips. The system checks for proprietary memory controllers, GPU firmware, and a secure enclave that no off-the-shelf board can provide. Even if someone could hack together a partial boot, the macOS end-user license agreement explicitly forbids running the operating system on anything but Apple hardware, a legal barrier that has chilled most public experimentation. For those determined to keep an Intel-based macOS alive, virtualization on Apple Silicon offers a narrow lifeline. Tools like UTM and Parallels can emulate x86 Macs within an M-series host, but performance is limited and many professional workflows are out of reach. These solutions feel more like a stopgap than a true continuation of the Hackintosh legacy. The technical and legal walls are simply too high, yet the echoes of the community's work remain. The Dortania Open Core Install Guide, stretching over 500 pages, stands as a monument to what was achieved. Its detailed explanations, troubleshooting steps, and hardware compatibility notes have outlived the era they were written for. In right-to-repair circles, Hackintosh is often cited as proof that users crave the freedom to modify and extend their machines, even in the face of increasing corporate control. The tools, guides, and stories preserved in forums and documentation are now part of a broader conversation about ownership, autonomy, and the right to tinker. The Hackintosh may be gone, but its spirit is woven into every debate about who truly controls the devices we rely on. Today, macOS runs only where Apple intends, on tightly integrated proprietary Apple silicon. The era of forum legends, patched texts, and do-it-yourself Mac towers has ended, but its spirit echoes in every right-to-repair debate and custom build. As walled gardens grow higher, the Hackintosh legacy challenges us to ask who really controls the machines we rely on. Share your Hackintosh stories or setups in the comments below.